through that pain comes purpose. And for me, that's the beautiful thing about Black history, is that a lot of the civil, political, social rights we enjoy really come from the pain of Black Americans and people that walked the path and believed in the possibility of freedom for all people. Mm-hmm. And I think in India, that movement is happening and has been happening, but because it's so much more of a complex place mm-hmm. around identity, it just takes its own time,
Hello, darling. You're listening to the Wake Up and Show Up podcast with your host, Portia Scott. This podcast is a collection of interviews and stories, weaving together life's pivotal moments and the decisions made to show up and impact humanity, one person at a time. I just want to pop in here and say thank you. Thank you for listening to the podcast, for sharing, rating, and reviewing. And don't worry, if you haven't, it's not too late to share an episode with your friends or family. You can give us a 5-star rating on Apple and write a review. This is so important because when you do this, it helps expose other people to the content, to the podcast that you enjoy. And not only that, is that it gives us the opportunity to move higher on the charts so that more people are exposed to the podcast. And as more people are exposed to the podcast, it allows us to inspire and impact more people. So I just want to say thank you so much. Think about sharing an episode, rating, and reviewing. Hello, darling, and welcome to this week's episode of the podcast. First of all, can you believe it's August? I can't. My kids are officially back to school, and Miracle is a high schooler. I cannot believe it. So all of the listeners out there, I am asking for your prayers and your hugs and all of your love as I process the fact that my daughter is in high school. My Maddox is in the 3rd grade, and man, the time just seems like it flies, which is why it's so important for us to be intentional and be present in the moments, because man, it goes by so fast. So I'm also excited because I get to hang up my digital homeschool teacher hat, and they are both back in school. I am super excited about that. But to be honest, the house is like eerily quiet. Like outside of the sound of my husband downstairs on his calls or watching a random show during his breaks, I don't have anyone coming in saying, hey, I'm hungry. What's for lunch? What's for breakfast? I forgot my call. What do I need to do next? What are you doing? Can we go here? Can we do that? So now I'm getting into the new rhythm of dropping the kids off and then having all of this time to actually work. So that's exciting. But one of the other things I'm excited about is today's episode. And I know I say that about every episode, but there are just some people that you immediately connect with. And when I met today's house guest, I knew he would be not only an excellent guest, but he would be someone that I wanted to be connected to. During our first meeting, he made my eyes water a little bit as we talked about unconscious bias and breaking biases, and how we can have unconscious biases for our own race and community. And needless to say, I left that call peeling back my own unconscious bias. And in September, I look forward to taking his class. And yes, I'm a Black woman and I am taking an unconscious bias class. But for me, it really is because of the biases that so oftentimes we have, as I said, within our own race, within our own cultures, that we don't even realize. And it is because we have heard the messaging that has been put out in reference to who we are. So I'm excited about taking that class. And if you listen to this episode, you'll also hear a little bit about that and why I think it's important for me to take that class as well. I also want to say happy 12-year anniversary to our house guest, because it was 12 years ago where he had this idea of Be More. And our house guest today is a scientist, educator, lawyer, and the founder of Be More with Anu. He is a sought-after expert in breaking bias, diversity, equity, and inclusion, entrepreneurship, mindfulness, and compassion. He has brought Be More's approach to over 200 companies, reaching over 20,000 professionals. He has logged over 10,000 hours of meditation and developed Be More's science-backed, compassion-based approach after conducting decade-long research on the causes of and solutions to racial and gender inequality. Our guest today has so many different accolades, but I think one of the things that you will take away that I took away was his passion to see people and to humanize all people. He's spoken about his work at TED, South by Southwest, and the Oprah Conversation, which we talk a little bit about. He has a JD from NYU Law, Master of Philosophy and Development Studies from Cambridge, and a BA in International Relations and Islamic Studies from NYU. I know you are going to enjoy today's conversation. Grab your coffee, tea, or beverage of choice, depending on when you're listening to this episode. Clear your mind and enjoy today's episode. Help me welcome today's house guest, Anu Gupta, to the podcast. Hi, Anu. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Portia. I'm so delighted to be here.
Anu, one of the things that I just loved when we were talking in our introductory call was just the love that you have for what you do. And I think if more of us loved what we do, I think the world would be a better place, and just loving people in general. So thank you so much just for the kindness that you're putting out into the world. And one of the things that we like to do on the podcast is we like to ask everybody, what are you grateful for today?
I am grateful for you in particular for inviting me to this podcast, because I've been looking forward to this. And I think I shared this with you a few months ago. Some of my teammates and I were doing some research around podcasting, and we found that there's next to no diversity there. So today, to be here with you and to really just share my journey to an audience, where diversity isn't something that needs to be explained, but it's just understood, it's quite refreshing. Mm-hmm. So thank you.
I love it. Thank you for coming on. It's so funny. We find out so much about people. And one of the things that I found out about you was that you met Oprah. And I listened to that episode that Oprah had with Isabel Wilkerson. And I wanted to talk a little bit about this because when I was listening to your story and listening to what you do now, it was really, just a culmination of what you do from where you were. So I want you to tell us a little bit about the story because of the work that you're doing, but the intersectionality that it has of how you initially grew up. So talk to us a little bit about going on that episode for the book, The Origins of Discontents, and kind of telling your story.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a company called Be More with Anu, and it's an education technology company. And what we do is we train individuals and organizations in science-backed, compassion-based tools to break bias. And one of our focuses right now is really helping people break racial bias and take systemic racism head on. So it's not just something we talk about and having conversations around, but we take action on it to make, to build communities and workplaces where everyone belongs, where we advance equity and belonging overall. I've started this company about 7 years ago. I was a lawyer before that. And I came to this work because in the courtroom, I realized that, we can change all the policies out there. And we have, it's not legal to discriminate anymore. Yet we have yet to change hearts and minds. And that's one of the reasons why there's such massive disparities, racial disparities across the board, whether it's education or healthcare or criminal justice. And for me, there was an opportunity to really use science and storytelling as means to really help people shift hearts and minds. And that was what I did with myself prior to starting this company. And that's what you heard on this episode with Oprah. So basically, to give everyone some context, one of my favorite authors in the world is Isabel Wilkerson. She wrote this incredible book about a decade ago called The Warmth of Other Suns, which is kind of this prolific story about African Americans as they escaped Jim Crow South from the 1890s onwards until the 1950s. It's known as the Great Migration. And over 6 million people moved. And the way they moved, internationally, this would be known as refugees. They were internally displaced people, and they were leaving Jim Crow because of just such harsh realities of violence and daily indignities that they experienced. And she called that they were seeking the warmth of other suns. Of course, I read the book when it came out, and it was part of my education, really waking up to the humanity of Black Americans, Black people in general. And the stories really resonated with me because a part of me, even though I'm not Black, my family moved here from India and I was an immigrant here. And in India, my family comes from pretty privileged background. Both my parents are doctors, and we're also of a higher caste or a dominant caste. In India, there's a pretty rigid caste system that's established, and it's not spoken of. You can't tell what caste one belongs to by looking at them, but you can through their last names, through asking them various questions, to really identify people. And, even though it's illegal, right, in India as well, to practice that, it's very much a social norm. So what Isabel has done in her research with The Warmth of Other Suns, which is all about race, right, what we call racism, is that she went into the science and anthropology and sociology of this, and she identified that it wasn't racism. Racism and race is inaccurate to capture the experiences of African Americans and other people of color. It's actually caste. Scientifically, we know there's no such thing as race. It's very much a socially constructed idea, but caste is very, very real. So this was her second book called, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent, where she talks about different societies, the US, India, and Nazi Germany, and shows how there are 8 different pillars of any caste system in the world, and how the caste system in America is rooted in what we call race, but it's actually caste. And in America, we could identify people's caste, their racial caste, based on appearance. India, it's based on occupation, historically. So it's really interesting that she was able to make that. And for me, the book was such a relief because first, I didn't have to do the research or write it. And she's such a prolific writer and has such an incredible platform. But it also resonated with my story because I've been someone who straddled these 2 caste systems all my life. In my early years, it was me being part of the dominant caste in India. And coming here, being closer to the subordinated caste, not being white. And in America, the dominant caste is being white. So that's what the conversation was about. I was so honored to be in conversation with Isabel and Oprah about the book. Now to your question around, well, how was it meeting Oprah? It was pretty incredible, right? Because she herself is someone who has defied caste as a human being, being born in the Jim Crow South and being able to escape the scourge of what it means to be a Black woman in this country. And, really not just lifting herself out of it, but lifting millions and billions of people with her in so many ways. So it was just a really beautiful and wonderful invitation that, what happened very coincidentally. It was not planned. And I was really happy to be part of that conversation. It really helped me stay focused on my work more, which is about teaching people to unlearn this caste system.
Yeah, because when I was listening to yours and I was like, I didn't know this. And so to see that intersectionality of how you grew up when you were in India and, part of the caste that you were part of, and then coming to the States and experiencing, as you said, kind of being of that subordinate class because you were non-white, and then doing the work, right? So I do have a question because so you come to the US and you realize, wow, I'm not of the class that I came from, but within your Indian peers or friends and family, is it still known, or is it still like you said, kind of like a thing you don't say, but you kind of know, even within being in the United States, but in your own kind of like Indian friend and family groups?
Yeah. It's a mix, right? So a lot of people do know, and it's very much accepted. And this is, it's a complicated thing around intersectionality. So on the one hand, one can be a person of color. On the other hand, they could be part of the dominant caste in the Indian caste system if they're of Indian origin. And there are people in the Indian American community is very divided along caste lines. Different castes have their own temple based on, linguistic groups, based on their ethnic groups, based on even caste groups. So it's a mix. And I think just as we're doing this work around breaking racial bias in the US, there has to be some similar work done around breaking caste bias within the South Asian context. And Isabel talks about that in her book when she talks to, in India, the subordinated caste they're known as the untouchables or Dalits, which really means Dalit is a word from an Indian language that means broken people. So very much like African Americans in this country who've been enslaved and tortured and so many other things, the Dalits have experienced that for generations, for millennia. And through that brokenness comes resiliency, right? Through that pain comes purpose. And for me, that's the beautiful thing about Black history, is that a lot of the civil, political, social rights we enjoy really come from the pain of Black Americans and people that walked the path and believed in the possibility of freedom for all people. And I think in India, that movement is happening and has been happening, but because it's so much more of a complex place around identity, it just takes its own time,
Right. But people like you that are doing the work and you're a scientist, you're a lawyer, educator, you're all these things, and you could literally tackle this head on doing something else. But like, I know you talk about just kind of being in law and kind of seeing the system and just that underlining reason, the purpose or the feeling of purpose of why you actually do the work. Because you could honestly do something else. You have so many other options, and then you tackle this issue of bias and racism or caste. What is really the underlying purpose on why you do the work that you do?
Yeah, it's pretty much just been kind of my calling, right? It's kind of turned my pain into purpose. And I don't actually have an answer. I just don't know. I just feel so passionate about it. I think it's, of course, my lived experience of experiencing racial bias. But it's more than that, because I think I've been able to access within myself the ability to know that I am so much more than the stories that have been created about me. And I want, it's just so much more fulfilling for me to see my students also experience that. I think one of the challenges of this past year has been the demoralization, particularly people of color and people in the Black community have experienced due to persistent police violence and killings and just, the continued stereotyping. So I can feel that. But I think there's a way that what I have learned is, and this is actually one of my coaches, who's also a Black woman who taught me this, how to move from being mindful of when we move into a victimhood and using the pain beneath that victimhood towards vision. And I think for me, that's the daily practice, moving from victim to vision. That's what a lot of our ancestors did too. And it just feels so much more fulfilling and gratifying because, yes, I could be a lawyer, I could make more money, I could do all these things. Then what are you going to do with the money? As long as your basic needs are met, as long as you're comfortable. I've known people who have so much money, yet they feel so lonely, they feel so alienated from their surroundings. And the work I do, allows me to be in touch with human beings one-on-one and to really help them heal deep-seated wounds, things they often don't even share with their family members and their loved ones. I'll share a story of one of my students who was in my Breaking Racial Bias class. She's of Asian descent, and basically even though she does work around diversity, equity, and inclusion for her organization, and her husband shares her ethnicity, her kids don't know what their background is. Her kids don't speak the language that she speaks. And just going through the course, she was like, wow, I never realized how much I have been trying to assimilate into whiteness before taking this course, that I have not even shared with my kids that they're of Asian descent and they think they're
Descent. Yeah.
it's just so like it's like wow, like that's a huge profound moment that I could help have for like senior executives and professionals. And because they have access to power, they can use their voice, they can use their actions and decision making to then channel more resources in their organizations.
Yeah, I love that. I don't know if you knew, but we had that first call, and I don't even know how we got on this, but you were kind of talking about the students that you teach that are, your white students, and talking about the biases and all of these things, and like unconscious bias. But then you talked about your students that are non-white, and the work that you do is around that. And I begin to like get tears in my eyes because I don't think that I ever looked at the layers or the motivators for certain things that I did or certain things that I said or how I wanted to separate myself, right, from maybe somebody who grew up in the inner city, and to make sure that I was essentially, my husband and I have this word, we say safe Black. And so in corporate America, he and I are what you would consider like safe Black. And the funny thing is, we didn't come from homes, my husband came from Los Angeles, South Central, single mom. I had two parents in the home, but, middle class, but still not having a whole bunch, not going to premier schools. But because we did go to college or we chose different paths, that we became safe in corporate, right? Like, oh, you're not like them. And although it always made us uneasy, it was also something that we rode the wave of too, it's saying, well, I want my kids to go to an all white school or an all white Christian school, or make sure they go to a private school. And there's nothing wrong with those things, but the motivations behind them. And the motivation behind them was this assimilation, kind of like she didn't really talk to her kids about being Asian or teaching them the language. And a lot of that is because you know what that's like. You know what that's like if your kids do know the language, or if they're too Asian, or if they're too Black, which I know that's not a thing, but it is in the US, and so trying to make sure you're setting your kids up. And it just made me cry because I don't think I had ever, and I always looked at myself as someone, my father was in the military, so I grew up around literally everybody. And so I could talk to any culture and go here and do this because I was so used to being around people who didn't look like me. But that was also the thing, is I was so used to being around people who did not look like me. So I didn't grow up in a Black community. I grew up in this multicultural community. And so with pretty much everybody trying to assimilate into what the dominant race is. So for me, I had to take that back and I had to sit in that for a little bit. But when you were creating the program, was that kind of the thing that you wanted to unearth for your students that were non-white?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you shared is so profound, and it's something that I've heard from hundreds and thousands of students over the last couple of years. And, what you're describing is really what caste is, right? And this is the problem with caste. Everyone tries to distance themselves from what is defined as a subordinated caste, what is defined as Black, at least in America. Even Black people, they don't want to fall into that stereotype because we're forced to do that. And, the opportunity for me is we have to heal our relationship with that and really heal our ancestry and be really proud of that. One of the things Isabel talks about in the book, which I didn't know, is that in the 1890s, 96% of Black women worked as domestic workers. 96%. So there's very few Black women and men in this country whose ancestry wasn't, included people who weren't domestic workers. And where's the shame in that? It's not they chose to be domestic workers. Maybe some of them did, but there were no other options for them. These were people that were trying to build their lives right after enslavement, not out of choice. So these were really, really some beautiful, resilient human beings. So how do we help people move over these dominant narratives of unworthiness and being not being good enough, to really taking pride in the deeper resiliency? Yes, they may not have They may not have the perfect diction, and they may not have the right ways to talk or walk or think. They were human beings, dignified human beings, right? And to really bring people to really feel into that. And I think for people of color, that's really important because we've been sold this narrative of what it means to have made it, what is success, what is the right way, which is often the white way. So for me, for people of color, this work is really about self-compassion. We do so much self-compassion work because particularly people like you who've made it in the corporate world, we're so hard on ourselves, me included. And I think for my white students, it's that similar work, but it's actually beginning to move deeper and deeper into their humanity and to shed this idea of whiteness altogether. And that is good work because for white people who believe they're white, in order to become white, they had to give something up. They had to give up their cultures. They had to give up their traditions. They had to give up their languages. They had to give up their clan and familial relationships in order to adopt what is now known as whiteness, in order to adopt this narrative of white supremacy, of white dominance, of white superiority. Greeks didn't believe that. Hungarians didn't believe that, as individuals, right? As cultures, because for them, they were like, oh, we're Hungarian. We're not, what is white? We don't know. But since this thing was developed in the last 100 to 200 years, it's really broken our humanity. It's created deep rifts within people that we can't access the more feeling parts of us. So that's kind of my goal, because that's basically what I've been able to access myself and it's been so healing for me because, it's really painful to feel better than someone else. It's really painful to feel entitled because beneath that entitlement, beneath that feeling of superiority is a deep insecurity.
Right. Because you have to keep it up.
Yeah.
Right? So, and there's times when you feel it, but you got to keep it up. And that's too much. It's a lot of work.
It's exhausting.
It is exhausting. I know we keep talking about this. Juneteenth just passed. We just celebrated Juneteenth. And my husband and I were kind of talking about this. And we were saying how 2.5 years later, they find out that they're free, that they've been free. The problem is you can't just free people. And this is not just for those slaves, but slaves in general. You say you're free, but you give them nothing. And so you don't even know how to be free because for generations, you have been enslaved. And we saw this in South Africa, even under the apartheid. And so if you go to the Cape and things like that, you still have that sense of they're still trying to figure out how to be free. And you would think we would know by now, but you're still operating under this system. And it's almost like, yeah, you're free, but I think that there's still underlying issues and underlying hurt and pain that you still are having a hard time trying to live free, right? So free in your Blackness or free in being Asian or Indian or whatever it is, because for so long, we've just been trying to figure out what that looks like. And especially when you're free without anything. So
yeah, and that's what Nina Simone really sang about. Like, I really feel like when I listen to her music, like this is the type of freedom that we want to really achieve, or at least hold an aspiration for ourselves. When that freedom that you're talking about, that freeness, isn't just about being able to work anywhere, walk anywhere. Of course, those things are a given. It's really mental freedom. Freedom from that pain, freedom from those traumas, freedom from the memories of internalized hatred or doubt, and just being able to go about your day without any worries. And that is the freedom that would really enable the human spirit to evolve, for us to really collaborate and be creative with each other.
And I think that the work that you're doing is doing that. And we've talked about unconscious bias a little bit, and I want to act like we have an audience or we have someone that's listening, and they're hearing it a lot, ever since really the George Floyd thing. And we all had to sit in that and watch
Yeah.
that and deal with that. And companies had to show up and figure out, what do we do now? And DE&I positions and departments
Right.
were popping up. And the ones that did have them, now they actually have to do the work. So explain what unconscious bias really is.
Yeah. So it's such a great question. And basically, when I think of bias, there's kind of two forms of bias. There's conscious bias and unconscious bias. So conscious bias is when someone knows what they believe in about a specific group of people. So for example, if a person believes that a woman's place is in the home, that's a conscious bias. They consciously believe that women are supposed to be at home, men are supposed to work outside. That's explicit belief. And for me, that's not interesting because, okay. And based on the science, we know that the vast majority of people no longer have conscious biases, particularly in America when it comes to race. But unconscious bias, on the other hand, is not what you consciously say you believe, but it's learned habits of thoughts that influence your decision making. So these are habits of thoughts. So you're not conscious of them, but they're just habits that come up over and over again. But they influence how you, remember, perceive, interact with other people, and also how you make decisions. So, for example, there's so much research done in healthcare where healthcare providers are providing lower doses of pain medication to darker skinned patients. Now, most of these doctors and nurses wouldn't be like, "Oh, I'm racist." Some of them are darker skinned themselves, right? But they're doing it, and we have the data that captures that, and it's because there's a learned habit of thought that associates darker skin with a lower pain threshold, and that's problematic, right? So for me, it's really important to being able to distinguish those things. And this is what's happening with George Floyd. Well, I'm not sure what was happening in the police officer's heart. He may be consciously biased, but most police officers, I don't believe, are consciously biased. Yet, we know that there's a repeated pattern of how they treat and dehumanize men of color, particularly Black men. And we have now the footage to show it. So what is going on in the body of a police officer, regardless of color, because some of them are Black themselves, when they see a Black man or a Black person running away from them, that they have to shoot 40, 50 times? This is part of the nervous system. These are the learned habits of thoughts that has begun to see and associate false ideas with other people's humanities. It's delusion. They're seeing ideas of the other people. And this is what, when in St. Louis, Mike Brown, when he was killed, the police officer in his grand jury testimony said, "It was as if I saw a monster." This was a teenager, like a 14, 15-year-old kid. How do you make that kid into a monster? Now, this man may have had conscious bias, but he's going to deny that there's not a racist bone in his body, right? Great. There's tons of unconscious bias that sees a 14-year-old as a monster.
Right.
And that is what we need to unlearn, and then learn and humanize one another, particularly Black people and other people of color.
Yeah, that's a lot. It kind of takes your breath away, right? Like, I have a 24-year-old son, and I remember when he served in the Navy, and he's out of the Navy now. He's living in Arizona and going to school. But I remember when we bought him his first car, and the first car was like a Ford Fiesta. Do you know how unassuming, unattractive, unluxury that car is? A Ford Fiesta. It was like hatchback. And I remember when we were going to register the car, because, we had purchased the car, we could register it with veteran plates. And we were like, let's get the veteran plates, because at least if he gets pulled over, maybe the cop will see him as a person. We got the veteran plates in hopes that if he ever got stopped, that they would see that first. We know that a lot of cops have been former military. They look up to the military. They, have some type of, there's this bond. And so just hoping. And that really is a shame. It wasn't like I have him on my car, but I have him on my car because I'm proud about it. But when we put it on his car, it was to hopefully save his life, right? Like, that he wouldn't get shot. And I think when you tell those stories, when you're doing this work, you really are humanizing people. And I think that's just the foundation of it, is that being able to see someone and see them as human, no matter skin color, no matter the culture, no matter sexual orientation, no matter religious beliefs, but seeing people as people. And so there's this thing I want to read because it was on your website and it really, really touched me. And it says, I don't want to live in a world where we exist as ideas of one another. I want to live in a world where we embrace the presence of one another, the real people. And as you're doing the work, do you believe we can actually live in a world where we can, in fact, embrace the ideas of one another and the realness of humanity?
Wakes me up every morning. That's why I get out of bed. That's the kind of world I want to create, where we can truly be in the presence of one another and not just these hokey pokey ideas that other people created about us. And that was really my journey, right? When basically for me, I came to this work because I began seeing that a lot of the things I believed about myself weren't things that I created about myself. It was things that were projected onto me. And I started believing other people's ideas of me. Like even the story you shared around wanting your children to go to private school or Christian school, or distancing yourself from, the inner city, whatever those things mean, right? Who created those narratives? And I'm like, wait, I have to distance myself from this because I didn't create those narratives, and really see myself for who I am. And I think the more people do that, they're able to overcome the shame and the guilt that accompanies just with being, right? And all of us have this, around various identities we have, whether it's class, whether it's education, whether it's professional success, right. Whether it's height, whether it's size, you name it, right? To be human is like to be part of this like diverse conglomeration of diversity of identities, right? And all of us have identities that have a certain level of privilege, and many others who are marginalized. And for me, like the goal is for us to use those identities that feel marginalized as a means to empower ourselves, to be stronger and more resilient, and to learn the lessons that we're here to learn.
Absolutely. So we've talked a lot about the what of what you do, a lot about what you do, but I want to kind of get into the meat of how you actually do it. And I think this will be helpful too to anyone listening. And, we were talking, you kind of talked about, you break your work up into these two components. So the tools you use for your white students or students, non-people of color students, and then the tools you use for people of color to help kind of heal them. And we've talked a little bit about that, but how do you take each of these groups kind of through your processes or through your workshops, or what does that look like for both of the groups? Because our audience, we have Black people, people of color, and we also have white people. So making sure that they understand how you kind of take them through that process.
So everyone goes through the same process, and certain things resonate more with certain individuals. And actually, it's agnostic to their racial background. But the way this works is that it's a Breaking Racial Bias course that's 5 weeks. And the whole idea is we want to balance out our left brain, our thinking brain, with our right brain, our more emotional feeling brain. So we're kind of the balance of the two. So one aspect of the work is really educating people around all the things they have been misinformed around or just haven't been taught. What is systemic racism? What is it? What is the connection between systemic racism with bias? How it impacts one's sense of self, interactions with others in the workplace, in our communities, and then what to do about it. So that's all left brain because we're learning things. But then the right brain stuff is really important because that's about, well, what do we do about it? Well, in order for us to unlearn these learned habits, we have to practice. We have to build new habits. And those habits are rooted in our toolkit called PRISM. And PRISM composes of 5 tools that we expect all of our students to practice every day for 5 weeks. 10 minutes a day, not too much, but really helping them build these new habits. And PRISM stands for perspective taking, pro-social behavior, individuation, stereotype replacement, and mindfulness. So we teach these tools, both their benefits, but also hand-holding people and practicing these tools for the 5 weeks. And the third and the most important component of the work is community. We are social animals. A lot of us, we're very, very driven and accomplished and ambitious, and we can do everything that's been told for us to do. But behavior change takes place in community. Habit creation is supported in community. And we're social beings, we're social animals. So we need that. So all of this learning and practice is taking place, with a community of professionals across the country, and very intentionally designed to be safe, judgment-free, and shame-free. So we want people to make mistakes and help them practice the tools they're learning. So once they leave our safe container, they can practice it outside to really advance change.
And so this is your toolkit is offered to, is it organizations only or organizations and individuals? Like, could I go on and?
Yes, absolutely. It's for individuals and organizations, anyone who wants to take it. And, I'd love for you to do it, and anyone else you think would benefit from these tools, because for me, the goal is the more people start practicing these tools, the more we can begin to shift the energy in doing this work from because for me, I was talking to someone today. I was like, what we're talking about is a step after being anti-racist, because being anti-racist is to be anti something, is to be against something. You have realized what it means to be living in a society where there's so much racial bias, and you want to distance yourself from it. You're angry, right? You're rageful. Important. But that's the first step. But now we want to be pro something. So I want to be pro racial equity, pro belonging for everyone, regardless of what they look like. And I want to be pro taking steps and actions to now create equity in my workplace and in my communities, in our nation. So that's kind of where we're moving to. So it's kind of like the graduation from anti-racism to being, pro-humanity. How do we now break down these barriers? Because we don't want to, I want to imagine a world without racism, but I can do that. I can't do that by myself. I need everyone else who's implicated in this racial caste system to imagine that same world.
And so give me an idea of what that Zoom meeting is. So you said it's the 5 weeks, but you guys do Zoom meetings, correct?
So the way it works is that it's 5 hours a week for 5 weeks. And there's 2.5 hours of self-led learning. So we have a learning platform. Basically, there's lots of micro videos and lots of assessments and reflection points to help people move them along. Because we know that not everyone's a big nerd like me who can read these dense books. We've simplified everything so people can get it. They're like, oh, this is how it was. Oh, okay.
It makes
sense. They
can
have these aha moments by themselves. Because what's one of the challenges with diversity trainings is that people are learning together. And oftentimes they're not able to pay attention to learning because they're trying to, they're trying to manage other people's impressions of them. They're walking on eggshells. So instead of learning, they're like, oh, what do other people think about me, right? It's like, okay, let's take that out, learn on your own in a safe container. Then there's 10 minutes a day of PRISM practice on your own. And then there's 90 minutes or an hour and a half weekly community check-in. So that's where we review everything you've done, in terms of what you've learned in that week's course, that module. And we break up into small groups, have big group conversations. Yeah, and it's really, really profound. It's really profound because people are able to then apply what they're learning to their lives, but most importantly, listen to other people's experiences.
Yeah, that's so good.
Yeah, that's the challenge in our country because we're so hyper-segregated. We don't know the other. So this is how we're building emotional intimacy with people beyond our racial and ethnic groups.
I never thought about that, about diversity training and how you do learn in this group. And instead of, learning, you're like, what do they think about me? Oh my God, they said this. I'm cringy. Like my coworkers are going to be so mad at me about this. And then, so I love how they kind of have this safe container to happen by themselves. But then you have this large group and then these smaller groups, right? And so we know in small groups, people are more apt to be open, to be vulnerable, to kind of talk amongst themselves. So I love how you've created this community with all of the people, right? So whites, non-whites, and people of color. And so now you really get to almost practice it in that meetup because it's not just all the Black people or non-white people together. And so you don't have that segregation thing yet again, but bringing people together. Give me an idea of how you have your people practice PRISM.
So what we've done is I've recorded meditations. It's usually through meditation or reflection practices. So they're 10 minutes. So they're basically, you download the recordings from our platform, put it on your phone or on your computer, and whatever time that works for you, morning, day, afternoon, but just 10 minutes a day. So beginning to practice those skills over time.
I love that. I love that it's a meditation. I didn't know what it was. So I was like, let me ask because I don't know.
Of course.
But I love how you've incorporated that, right? Just the mindfulness and the intention of it, and when we're taking that break, that 10 minutes to really be mindful, to be intentional, to be present with it. I love that. And I'm sure it gives people, because we're so busy. So what better way than to just like have this meditation, like this quiet time and time of reflection. So I want to ask, what do you hope people and organizations will do with the lessons that they're learning? Like what impact do you see this making in the world?
I think my biggest hope around this work is to really support people with the tools to advance racial equity and belonging, both in their workplaces and their communities. So for me, one of the things I've witnessed is that there's a lot of conversations happening around diversity and inclusion, but these conversations have been happening since the 1960s. The state of racial disparities remains the same. So what we need is to really address the root causes. We think about challenges as, we need to do more diverse recruiting. We need to do more diverse hiring or advancing. But I'm like, okay, even if you have more diverse people that are coming in, how are you going to retain them? And even if you retain them, are they really advancing to senior roles? Right? Are they compensated equally? So again, we make these into these piecemeal issues, but the root cause is unconscious bias. If we just address the unconscious bias, we can address issues of recruitment. We can address issues of advancement and compensation. So it's kind of, for me, it's like, okay, we have to talk about bias. We have to learn the skills to actually measurably break bias.
Anu, I want to ask, as a child, were you always kind of that child that was like taking up for other people, like taking up for yourself, like, no, you're not going to say this? Like, was that always kind of your personality?
Oh my gosh, I wish it was my personality. I always admired those people. I was a very quiet child and a very I think I spoke up enough in the classroom but just was mostly an observer because I was afraid to share of being wrong. I was a perfectionist. So I was very introverted in that way. But I think my personal journey of breaking bias has been to really kind of center myself in my own greatness and shine my light. And knowing that by shining my light, I'm not dimming anyone else, but giving others the same permission to shine their light and to really live into the gifts and talents that they were born with.
I asked that question because the work that you're doing, I think a lot of us kind of say, okay, well, it's DE&I, it's diversity training, but it takes someone standing up, right? Like it takes this bravery that we don't always want to say, but it is true because you're really going against social norms. You're pushing the envelope. You're making people look at themselves. You're making organizations look at themselves. And so I was just wondering, was he that child that was always pushing the envelope? So it's funny that when you get into purpose, you will be so surprised at what it brings up, right? That because you're walking in this purpose that you're like, I have to do this. Like, I don't have another choice but to fight for other people.
And the other thing that I learned was that in all of my education, one thing that people talked about was efficiency and wastefulness and how we have to protect our scarce resource of money. And I'm like, bias is like the most expensive thing that a company has as a liability. And I'm like, why would you not want to save yourself, wasted costs of bias? And on top of that, make more money by addressing bias. So like for me, like the business case of it is just so obvious. But this goes back to how this is not a rational thing. People have an emotional fear of this topic. So they would rather waste billions of dollars. There's a foundation that calculated that racial bias costs our economy $2 trillion a year. So we'd rather as a nation waste $2 trillion a year than like address this issue. Mm-hmm. And this is why I'm like, all this like rational thinking, we know this rational thinking, we just came out of COVID.
Right.
If rational thinking had worked, it would not have been a disaster as it was in the purportedly the richest country in the world.
Exactly. Crazy. So I want to ask this question, and I kind of ask everybody this question. I'm actually excited about what your answer is going to be, but just imagine that you have been able to help millions, and not just here in the US, but around the globe, to just change our unconscious biases as it relates to just race and culture. And I mean, everything, when we just think about those biases. And like you said, even in the cast of, well, where did you go to school? Or what is your profession? Or asking those questions really to see if someone is on the same level you are or a subordinate level, as we like to think. But you've been able to touch the lives. You've been able to really change the narrative around unconscious bias. And people are like just sharing your methods and sharing your content around the world. What is the one thing that you are most proud of?
Wow, such a beautiful question. I have the answer, but I'm trying not to cry. I think the one thing I'd be most proud of is reduction in disparities. Seeing fewer of our kids, Black and brown kids, be shuffled into prisons, being disciplined in schools, people like me getting equal level of healthcare, opportunities for professional advancement. Yeah, transformation of our justice system into something more humane. Those are the things that, I played a part in seeding compassion and seeding understanding among people who made those decisions.
I love that. So I'm trying not to cry now, but it was just beautiful. And Anu, thank you, one, so much for coming on the podcast. This was just a great conversation. You taught me some stuff. And so I know that our listeners and our community is going to be so grateful and helped listening to what you do, how you do it, and just all the knowledge that you have. So thank you so much. But I do want to make sure that we know, how can we keep in touch with you? How can we keep in touch with the organization? Sign up for the unconscious bias training, just all the things that you do.
Yeah, thank you so much, Portia, for having me. So people can, follow me on Instagram or LinkedIn at Be More with Anu. So it's BEMORE with Anu, ANU. And you can learn about our Breaking Racial Bias course, our Breaking Unconscious Bias courses at BeMoreWithAnu.com. We'd love for you to be a part of our Breaking Racial Bias courses. That's really my focus, given the state of our nation right now. Cost is a barrier. We have a scholarship program, financial aid program. We don't want to turn anyone away from being able to take this course. There's a short form that you can fill out as a quick application. But all we ask is that people commit to those 25 hours over 5 weeks. And we really, do invite you to join our community. What we're doing is really building a movement together of people that have gone through our courses to really stay connected with one another through all sorts of community events, because they have a shared understanding of these topics and are now getting activated to apply these practices into their workplaces and communities.
I love it. Anu, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you.
I'll leave you with this. To be able to love your enemy is to be able to humanize them. Anu Gupta. As always, we end every show with this declaration. Waking up is automatic. Showing up is intentional. Today, I will show up. Thanks again for spending time with me today and listening to the Wake Up and Show Up podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe so you never miss a show, leave a 5-star review, and share with a friend or foe. You can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at I Am Portia Scott. Until next time, go impact the world.